very warm welcome. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you very much, Samuel, for making it possible. I hope you have a great time in Cambridge. And I'm really pleased to have 2 hours of your precious time. 1 hour, we deal with the boom and bust cycle. And then, as Samuel said, we delve into the idea of privatizing money. So these are very relevant and important topics. And I try my very best to give you the best presentation ever. But it's up to you to decide after the 2 hours. So if you agree, we just get into the first topic. And whenever you feel uncomfortable with what I'm saying, please do not hesitate to come forward, raise your hand. And I try to make sure that we have plenty of time for discussion. But now let us start with a short introduction to the Austrian business cycle theory. What are my objectives? My objectives are introducing and making you familiar with the basic elements of the Austrian business cycle theory. And secondly, I would like to outline that this is not just a theory, this is the theory for explaining boom and bust. Because the whole theory is not an empirical theory, it rests on logical deduction. So it has a very rigorous foundation. That's important to understand. And thirdly, raising critique of using the mathematical method in explaining the Austrian business cycle theory. That is also an important aspect. You know, when you study economics these days, the representatives from the Austrian school reject math. Not because they don't know how to calculate, how to come up with balance sheets and investment calculations. The basic idea is that you cannot bring human action into mathematical equations. So these three things, I hope I can make you familiar with.
And I would like to give you some reading recommendations. To start with, I highly recommend the book Austrian Business Cycle Theory, an introduction written by Paul Swick and published in 2024. Also, the book Time and Money, the Macroeconomics of Capital Structure, written by Roger Garrison, published in 2001. And of course, you should read the chapters on money and credit in Ludwig von Mises' Human Action, a Treatise on Economics, as well as his article, The Austrian Theory of the Trade Cycle. And finally, a great book is America's Great Depression, written by Murray Rothbard, as well as his excellent essay, Economic Depressions, Their Cause and Cure.
Now, when I say boom and bust, I think it's important for you to understand what I'm saying, what I'm talking about, and what I'm not talking about. A very simple illustration. This is time, and this black line is, let's call it, gross domestic product, or the amount of goods and services produced over time. As you know, as an economy grows over time, output increases, ideally. But normally you have business fluctuations. Sometimes economic expansion is a bit faster, sometimes it slows down a bit because people go on vacation, new innovations, whatever reasons are to be held responsible. There are certain fluctuations in reality as far as output creation is concerned. It's not running like a linear trend. But this is not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about, that's the red line, the big swings. For instance, a boom, when economic activity accelerates very strongly and rises well above what you normally would assume to be a potential output level, followed by bust. And then the boom returns. The business cycle is a recurrence of boom and bust, boom and bust. And many economists have been trying very hard to understand what causes boom and bust. Because boom and bust is not a good thing. In a boom, there's a squandering of scarce resources. People make wrong decisions. Business people make bad decisions, and then they go bust, and jobs are lost. Defaults occur. People lose their lifetime savings. And to give you an illustration of boom and bust, you can see on this graph from the early 1920s to the late 1950s, the Dow Jones Industrial, what is it? It's a stock market index. Calculate a number of stock prices, put them together, and then you get an idea where the stock market is moving. Towards the late 1920s, the stock market rose very strongly, from basically 100 points to close to 360 points. That was a boom. People enjoyed that boom because people were thinking, oh, we're getting richer. Companies made lots of profit. People had great jobs and wage increases. And then it was followed by a crash, a bust. In October 1929, the stock markets around the world, in particular in the US, started declining. The US stock market went down from 360 points down to, I think, close to 40 points. It lost 90% of its value. Boom, bust. And by the way, if you have bought here, you had to wait until 1957 to get your capital back, disregarding dividend payments. So you can imagine this was a very severe and dangerous period. Just to give you some numbers, real GDP in the US fell between 25 and 30%. So income was 100 before the bust came, and then it went down to 70. Unemployment rose from 3% in 1929 up to 25%. People didn't have any jobs no more. They couldn't feed their family. Industrial production went down 50%. The money supply contracted by round about 30%. Banks failed. Roughly between 9,000 and 11,000 commercial banks suspended or failed between 1929 and 1933. Your money was gone. The bank shut down and you couldn't get your money back. It was gone. So it was a very severe development. And again, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell roughly 90% in the period under review. Now, you understand why people and economists have an interest in understanding boom and bust. And in a nutshell, I give you a summary up front so you understand what we are talking about later. The Austrian business cycle theory in a nutshell. The first point, the central bank, in cooperation with commercial bank, increases the quantity of fiat money through credit expansion, money creation out of thin air. You are informed nowadays we've got a fiat money system. Whenever banks extend a loan to a consumer or producer, they create money out of thin air. Second, the increase in bank credit lowers the market interest rate below the level that would prevail had the supply of bank credit not been expanded. So banks get into the market and increase their credit supply. What happens? Right. The interest rate goes down because there's more credit available relative to demand. Number three, the decline in interest rates makes businesses to increase their investment while people increase their consumption and reduce savings. So the interest rate goes down. It becomes more attractive for companies to do something with the money. And so they engage in new investments. The artificially lowered interest rate encourages businesses to invest more. At the same time, the interest rate goes down. What happens with the people? They save less because you get less for your money. Consume more. So people save less, consume more, and companies invest more. And that means a boom comes underway. The economy expands, company profits rise, new jobs are getting created. And then sooner or later, however, firms realize their profits and returns fall short of expectations. They have made calculations and have expected that their investments yield a return of, say, 20%. And over time, they realize, the stuff I need to buy to produce my products is more expensive than I thought. So input costs rise, and of course, the return on investment gets disappointing. So companies abandon their investment projects. They do no longer demand labor. They do no longer ask for commodities and raw materials, etc. And the boom gets into a bust. Firms stop and liquidate their investments, cut jobs, businesses struggle as far as their debt servicing is concerned. Another very important aspect, because in a boom, people tend to take on new loans because interest rates are so low. But if you run out of business, it's very hard to pay interest and pay down your loan. So you get defaults on a grand scale. Now, as corporate defaults rise, banks become more hesitant to roll over maturing loans or to extend new loans, and the inflow of new money into the economy dries up. Of course, banks realize, oh dear, in our portfolio we have credit risk. Some borrowers do no longer repay. They default. So let's get more cautious. So they rein in credit supply. And so, for instance, borrowers who expected to renew maturing loans with new loans run into liquidity problems. They have to repay their loans, but they don't get new loans. And so defaults rise. Defaults rise, the interest rate rises. And savings increase, consumption and investment decline to their pre-boom level. Number 9, and so the boom is followed by bust. The bust is the recession, depression, and that is the period in which overconsumption and over or malinvestment are eliminated or corrected. That's a very important insight. Most people, of course, don't like the bust. They like the boom. The drinking and dancing, that's the great part. But the sobering up and the cleaning up is the hard part. The boom is the period in which overconsumption and malinvestments occur, and the bust is cleaning up the mess. Prices for assets, commodities, wages, etc. fall, thereby paving the way for an economic recovery. If the government doesn't do anything, companies default. People lose their jobs. Wages go down, commodity prices go down, companies get liquidated, and sooner or later, smart investors come in and find out prices are pretty low. It's good. It's a good opportunity to buy a company, to engage in new investments, and then you get your recovery. And we end with a question. Why is there a boom and bust cycle? The recurrence of boom and bust. I just showed you the boom and bust. The question now is, how come boom and bust cycle? Answer, because the central bank, as soon as the boom turns into bust, artificially lowers the interest rate and increases credit and money supply. And guess what happens? The same show kicks in. And so you get your boom and bust cycle. And when we look at reality, it's not like boom is followed by bust, and then bust gives you another boom. There could be a huge bust, a bust that could wipe out large chunks of economic capital in an economy. The boom and bust cycle is caused by the fiat money regime, according to the Austrian theory, by central banks. Central banks cause boom and bust. Okay, and Murray Rothbard, you see, in a nutshell, he wrote, I think it's a fantastic quote, like the repeated doping of a horse, the boom is kept on its way and ahead of its inevitable comeuppance by repeated and accelerating doses of the stimulant of bank credit. It is only when bank credit expansion must finally stop or sharply slow down, either because the banks are getting shaky or because the public is getting restive at the continuing inflation, that retribution finally catches up with the boom. As soon as credit expansion stops, the piper must be paid and the inevitable readjustments must liquidate the unsound overinvestments of the boom and redirect the economy more towards consumer goods production. And of course, the longer the boom is kept going, the greater the malinvestments that must be liquidated and the more harrowing the readjustments that must be made. Quote ends. So if central banks, this is another very important message for us, try to intervene to stop the bust, they basically make it worse further down the road. It's like kicking the can down the road. That's another insight offered by the Austrian School of Economics. I told you about the mathematization of economics, why the Austrians wouldn't do that. I skipped that because you understand it already. And now we address three aspects that need to be explained by a good theory. Economists realize, this boom and bust phenomena is a real world phenomena, and it is characterized normally by three factors. First factor, there's a cluster of errors. In a free market, businessmen and entrepreneurs constantly make forecasts about future prices, consumer demand, and the profitability of investments. Individual errors happen all the time. We are all humans. Some entrepreneurs are successful, others are not successful. Sometimes, a couple of investors are successful, and sometimes even more investors are not successful. But in a free market economy, these errors, these individual errors, tend to cancel one another out or get corrected quickly by competition and market feedback. So if one company struggles, another good player comes in and buys up the ailing company. During the crisis phase of the boom and bust cycle, however, there is a sudden, widespread revelation that investments and sales expectations were systematically mistaken. So not only some companies realize we have made bad investments, but basically all of them. Be that in the consumer goods industry, be that in the investment goods industry, all of them find themselves in a situation where their businesses no longer live up to expectation. And this is the cluster of errors effect that needs to be explained. The second factor that needs to be explained by a good boom and bust theory is that capital goods industries get hit more strongly than consumer goods industries. That's another thing you can observe, for instance, in the stock market. Companies that are engaged in industrial goods production, construction industry, etc., so they are involved in very time-consuming investment processes, typically get hit much harder than companies that produce consumer goods. Another common feature of the boom and bust cycle also calls for an explanation. It is the well-known fact that capital goods industries fluctuate more widely than do consumer goods industries. And there's another observation, the third observation that needs to be explained. There are big changes in credit and money supply. In a boom, there's typically a rather strong expansion of bank credit and money creation. Many companies, new businesses seek funding and banks come in and supply credit generously. And the quantity of fiat money also increases. As I said earlier, whenever a bank in a fiat money regime extends a loan, it creates new money out of thin air. It's like counterfeiting money. And this is, of course, associated with also capital costs go down. And conversely, there tends to be, when there's a slowdown of economic activity, bank credit slows down or even contracts and the money supply contracts. As I told you, in an extreme case like 1929, the bank money supply shrank by roughly 25%. So these three things need to be explained. And now we unpack the Austrian business cycle theory in three elements and later put it back together and then you've got it. The first element is we have to think about consumer goods, capital goods, time, and the production structure. It's all very simple. The Austrians make a distinction between higher order goods or production goods and lower order goods or consumer goods. Consumer goods are readily available for consumption. A production good is used for producing another production good and ultimately producing a consumer good. The things we enjoy today as consumer goods have a history. They are produced along time-consuming roundabout production. That's what the Austrian emphasize. This is time, and you would start over here with raw materials. You get them out of the earth, and then you put in some additional resources, labor and whatever is needed. You insert more resources, and then you get a manufacturing process. The value increases. It becomes more valuable as a manufactured good. And then the whole thing gets into the wholesale selling process. Additional labor is added, and ultimately it ends in a retail shop. Over time, the value, the market price of the goods and services produced increase, okay? Time is a factor, and these stages of production. And you can imagine a modern, highly developed economy has very, very, very many stages of production. If you are an underdeveloped economy, you have very few stages of production. If you are a very developed economy, you have the many production processes that need to be coordinated with each other. So you have to get price signals have to be correct, and interest rates, and that's the first element we have to think about. The second element is the so-called production possibilities frontier. It's a very real world concept. If you have an income of 10 apples, you can either consume 10 apples or you consume, say, 3 apples, and 7 apples you invest, put them in the earth and wait for the apple tree to come out. That is your production possibilities frontier. On the vertical axis, we have consumer goods, and on the horizontal axis, we have investment goods. This is the production possibilities frontier. Why does it look like this? Is it convex or is it concave? Very good, concave. And why is it concave? Because there's this law of diminishing marginal returns. The first apple you don't consume and invest, you invest it in the best, highest yielding opportunity. The second apple you don't consume and invest, you invest in the remaining, in the investment opportunity that gives you the highest yield still available. Because there's this law of diminishing marginal returns, you get this kind of concave shape for the production possibilities frontier. So you have a menu basically in point A, all your apples are getting consumed, no apple is getting invested. Or you reduce your consumption of apples. Some apples you don't eat, and the apples you don't eat, you invest. And whatever you prefer, you are moving along this production possibilities frontier. Now, if an economy grows, you get more goods and services, then this production possibilities frontier moves to the right or outward. More apples and more investments at the same time. So we all love to live in a growing economy because it gives us more goods and services over time. And then the third element, we have the market for loanable funds, the market where the interest rate is determined. The vertical line shows you the interest rate level, the horizontal line, savings and investments. So we're talking about a given income, let's say 10 apples, and you decide which apples you consume or the number of apples you invest or save and invest. And the supply and demand for savings gives you the market clearing interest rate. I think you are familiar with the concept. And just as a digression, as a footnote, I just want to make you familiar with the concept of the time preference theory of the interest rate. Whenever you look into an economics textbook, you will find that there are plenty of theories trying to explain the interest rate. John Maynard Keynes, for instance, came up with a liquidity preference theory of the interest rate. Or the neoclassic economists, they came up with the productivity-related explanation of the interest rate. And the Austrians, they side with the pure time preference theory of the interest rate. Time preference means you value an apple today higher than an apple in 1 year. And the interest rate is the discount the future good suffers relative to the present good. And the interest rate can be explained by the pure time preference theory. And that's what the Austrians do.
Consider a simple example. I offer you $1 in 12 months in exchange for 99 cents now, and you decline. Then I offer you $1 in 12 months in exchange for 95 cents now, and you agree. In this case, your interest rate is around 5.26%. That is, open bracket $1 over 95 cents minus 1, bracket closed, times 100 equals 5.26%. The interest rate reflects your personal originary interest rate, the manifestation of your time preference. The originary interest rate reflects the discount of the future good, in our case $1 in 12 months, relative to $1 available in the present. In other words, you value $1 in 12 months more highly than 95 cents or less now.
Now we put it back together. Now we become a bit more constructive. We start with an economic system in so-called equilibrium. Here, I hesitate to use the word equilibrium because in human action there is nothing like an equilibrium in terms of total satisfaction. We always act. Acting means exchanging one state of affairs against another state of affairs. We never do not act. And for instance, if you buy an Apple stock for $300 per stock, it's not an equilibrium price in the sense that the world gets frozen at that point in time. It's just a transaction that is made possible by the price of $300 per stock. A second afterwards, you have sold the stock or bought the stock, you are driven by other desires. You want ice cream or you want to meet your friends or whatever. Human action, for logical reason, does not know an equilibrium. Now you see what you have already learned. Here we have the diagram where it shows you the production structure over time. On the vertical axis you have the consumer goods and the horizontal line is time. And then you have the production possibilities frontier, and over here you have the interest rate market. And we assume we have a certain situation where we have point A0, there's a certain consumption level, and there's a certain investment level. Supply and demand for funds come together and you have an equilibrium interest rate, and that is the starting point for our analysis. The first case is that people's time preference declines. People become more forward-looking. They value the future satisfaction of wants higher. That's what they always do, but even higher than before. They are inclined to consume less, save more, and invest more. What happens if people's time preference declines? What happens is, let's start in the interest rate market, the amount of savings increase. People out of current income consume less and save more. And as a result, the interest rate declines. If the interest rate declines, it becomes more profitable to engage in investment activity. And as we have already seen from here, consumption goes down. So you have a situation where consumption declines out of current income and investment increases. And thirdly, the slope of the time structure of production becomes flatter. It moves from the previous consumption level to a lower consumption level. At the same time, more resources are getting invested in time-consuming production process. So this is actually the process through which an economy becomes richer, more prosperous, saving more, investing more, raising productivity and total output. And what happens if there is economic growth? What happens is, that's the important point here, the possibilities frontier of production moves outward. And as a result, the time structure of production curve moves outward. And now, what happens if there's money creation through bank credit expansion? I made you aware at the start of our talk that banks increase the money supply through credit expansion. What happens is the savings curve is moved to the right, but not because people want to consume less and save more and invest more, just because fake money has entered the economic system. People think that there are more resources available, more apples to invest, but it's just money that has been increased. But what happens is the interest rate declines, and as a result, investment increases, consumption increases, and the economy moves from point A0 to A1 to an unsustainable situation. You are overextended. And what happens with the structure of production? The curve gets kinked. You get more consumption goods and more investment goods, and that illustrates the disequilibrium in the economy. The period expanding credit supply, lowering the interest rate below the level that would prevail without bank credit expansion is what we call the boom. The boom brings you from A0 to A1. People are happy. More jobs, more profits, stock prices go up, and sooner or later, the bust kicks in. And what happens in a bust? You move from this overextension of resources to a situation in which you are worse off than before. Because if you have made bad investment decisions and the capital squandered, you have done things, built homes no one is interested in, and that is the problem with the boom and bust cycle. The boom is a period in which you get abnormal increases in economic production, but it is followed by a correction, and the correction could leave you worse off compared to the situation before the boom started. So if boom turns to bust, don't fight recession depression. Defaulting banks, defaulting big companies, mass unemployment. I'm not in favor of mass unemployment, but the remedy of lowering interest rates and ramping up government deficit policy does not solve the problem, makes it just worse. The only way to deal with a correction in the aftermath of a boom is a bust. And so Murray Rothbard wrote, quote, what the government should do, according to the Austrian analysis of the depression and the business cycle, is absolutely nothing. It should stop its own inflating, and then it should maintain a strict hands-off, laissez-faire policy. Anything it does will delay and obstruct the adjustment process of the market. The less it does, the more rapidly will the market adjustment process do its work and sound economic recovery ensure. Quote ends. Murray Rothbard. So you can see the recommendation given by the Austrian School of Economics is very, very different from today's mainstream economic recommendations. What can we learn from the Austrian business cycle theory? I think we can learn 4 things. Today's fiat money regime is the root cause for boom and bust cycles and all the economic devastation it brings. Boom and bust cycles are not caused by war in other countries or lockdowns or tax issues. It's a monetary phenomenon. It's driven by changes in the credit and money supply. And in today's monetary order, we have central banks. They hold the production monopoly of money, and they give out licenses to commercial banks to participate in the money creation.
At the end of the day, it's the central bank system. It's the fiat money regime that is the root cause of the boom and bust cycle. The second lesson is the Austrian business cycle theory explains why booms are bad because they cause overconsumption and malinvestment, and that the bust is actually good as it corrects misallocations of scarce resources caused by the boom. The third lesson is if boom turns to bust, the government and its central bank should do nothing, refrain from any kind of market intervention. And lesson number 4. The Austrian business cycle theory makes a convincing case for ending government's control over money production, closing central banks, and opening up a free market in money. And now I say thank you very much for your attention.